So, like I said, so I'm just going to share my screen. Basically, this week, so let me just make that full screen. Good. So I think you should see the full screen and not my because I have a double monitor, right? So you see the full slides. That's all good. Yeah. If someone just want to give me a thumbs up, that would be great. Okay. Perfect. Um, Yeah, so basically, last week, just to kind of rekindle the ideas, we were kind of looking at how we looked at some of the excerpts from Donna Haraway's Situated Knowledge, and with the mind of basically problematizing or giving a question to what the site of situatedness is and how it may be different in a high dimensional space. What we are calling a high dimensional space is basically a kind of synonym for complexity, if you want, which is a kind of structural condition of how I understand planetary space. We were also talking about navigation as a kind of synthesis between, the synthesis between map territory, thinking and doing, etc. And also thinking about navigation outside of just like what is given to us, right? But like navigation implies that you maybe have to start creating sites or these concept spaces. So that's quite important. And then I guess more directly from Haraway, we were kind of like stuck on that interesting phrase that she had, right, about what we learn, being accountable. We learn how to see, but also being accountable for what we learn where to see, right? So I'm really kind of privileging that question of where. Um, and I think that's, I mean, and then yeah, they kind of introducing this concept of like, or this idea of moving away from accepting this ready-made space of the kind of Euclidean framework to the question of how does one make ready our points of orientation for this new type of or this new high dimensional coexistence, basically. So this is a, I think I'm really excited about this problem because it is also, I think, it's a problem that I think touches a lot of disciplines, and a place where I feel that my own field, the visual arts, can maybe start to have some more productive traction beyond just making exhibitions, if you want. So yeah, and this was of course the diagram that was that corresponded with the article that I had submitted, and it was basically the starting point. The reason why I'm basically supplying you with articles that I've written in a sort of sequence because this was the one that really catalyzed a really concrete, or let's say more in depth thinking about this spatial problem that was sort of launched in my head by asking the simple the question like how do you define what are the borders of location within a planetary dimension space, right? How do we understand something as local? How do we define the border of what is not local, etc., right? And in our everyday speech, we usually have a kind of common agreement about what that means. If I tell you, oh, the shop is local, you'll kind of have an idea. Maybe it means it's walkable, etc. But obviously, that's a pretty I would say unhelpful heuristic when we're speaking about different scales of existence. So that was a sort of I'd say main theme of the last week, and and then this week what I wanted to do to just begin, like I said, I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over some key terms. Again, for some of you, I apologize if these are a bit like philosophy 101, because some of these terms are very well known. But I just feel like considering we're in a really interdisciplinary space with a lot of different backgrounds, it can't hurt to just go over them relatively quickly so that there's no confusion when we read them in the text or when I'm using them in a lecture format, that we have a kind of common understanding of what we mean. And certainly we can start like this sort of, the first couple of terms I would say are related to the question of like, what binds us to the givenness of the here and now, right? Like, why is it so hard to think outside of the constraints of the here and now? And one answer to such question, at least according to Foucault, would be this episteme. And I never know if someone knows the actual proper way of saying this. I've heard it said so many different ways. So I don't feel like there's a consensus on this. So please correct me if you know the exact way to say it. Um, but yeah,
Uh,
so basically, what's that?
oh, it's episteme.
Episteme. Okay, great.
Episteme. Yeah.
Episteme. Okay. We've got a Greek speaker that's hopefully instructing. So okay, so the episteme um, is basically, as you know, as the quote says, it's these kind of fundamental codes of the culture that establish for every man, for the very first, the empirical orders with which he will be dealing and within which he'll be at home. So I was using this in the context of thinking about it as this kind of, it's obviously a ground of positive self-reference upon which our knowledge orders are positively rooted. And by positive, I don't mean that as a moral definition. I just mean that that is how they kind of root their position of self-reference. It's broadly what allows us to identify brackets of history, right? There's a kind of modern episteme. There's a See, now I'm not going to be able to say it. The modern episteme, a medieval episteme, etc. Right, and it's I guess a way that we could, if we're doing this kind of like historical archaeology, we could identify these sort of broad epochs, even though there's hundreds of years. They compose of hundreds of years, and changes do occur within them. But basically, we can think of the episteme as the kind of a kind of boundary making operation upon what is thinkable, what is adjudicated as proper ways of knowing, what is a relevant question, etc. And I think it's also important to note within the context that we're dealing with, right? Like, not only is it a way of domesticating thought, which I think has some interesting resonance within feminist work as well on themes of domesticity, but we're not going to touch on that today. But the term itself is basically related to the question, like the etymological roots of it are related to a kind of combination of knowing and placing, right? So this kind of concept of placing things is also sort of internal, baked into that concept of the episteme. And the next one that I would want to bring up is, and again, I bring up episteme because this is a fundamental concept for Winter, as well as sociogeny, which she borrows from Frantz Fanon. And his particularly this concept was introduced in Black Skin, White Masks, and basically it is kind of it is this kind of way this social kind of encoding gets reproduced and rehearsed. So Fanon famously said, besides phylogeny and ontogeny, stands sociogeny, right? So what he's basically saying is that he's kind of giving parity, if you want, to the social domain, the artificial domain of human existence, on par with that of like biological concerns of the human, right? Saying, so for Winter, this is fundamental because she's kind of going against the tendency of Western European thought that she's criticizing, that thinks they can capture the human through biophilic or phylogenetic categories alone. And she says, no, no, no. This third level of existence is precisely what this kind of, which has definitely got more of an existential bent, is a kind of. She even goes so far as to say we need to complete the Fanonian epistemic revolution. So basically, uh, sociogeny is a term that Fanon coined to describe these feedback processes between um, structures and the internalization of the structures, both on the part of, and he's looking, of course, at the racialized, colonialized circumstances where, um, you know, feelings of superiority are internalized on the part of the oppressor, and feelings of an self-adjudication of inferiority is adopted by those colonized subjects, and kind of in a kind of critical move of in a kind of critique of psychiatry, because of course he's a psychiatrist. He's looking at the case of, say, like something like racism, right, where it would be absolutely ridiculous to tell a patient of yours, someone that comes to you suffering psychological distress, to to cure them by better adapting them to their environment, which is pathologically against them, right? So the only cure in that way is what Fanon called socio-diagnostic, which is basically like, the cure is political agitation, right? Um, so basically, for Fanon, this kind of psycho-existential complex of anti-Black racism, it manifests in this double process. Like I said, in this, he's borrowing from W. Du Bois' double consciousness. So that objectively structured suppression of economic possibility, reinforced by this subjective internalization. So this is what makes, when we hear later in Winter's work about a sociogenic replicator code, it's this feedback dynamic that is making this sort of an operational principle, and completely stratifying human societies. So but the question, because we're looking at this, or at least I'm trying to look at Winter and her set of influences from this, let's say, operationalizing standpoint, how are forms of social, come to the question of, how are forms of social encoding operationalized beyond this pure concept, right? So I think that we need to be adding, besides phylogeny, ontogeny, and sociogeny, there also stands technogeny, right? So we're going to be adding a kind of rejoinder to this. And again, to clarify, what do we mean by techne here, right? Which is not just technology for those. It also has a correlation to art. It's quite a bit more general than just technology. But I'm going to borrow Keith Tilford's helpful distinction, because he's also opening up a space for us to later bring this into the computational realm. But so Tilford writes that techne is meant to designate not only the classic reversibility or relay with episteme that it often carries in philosophy, right? So it's, in this basic sense, it's exactly that operator, if you want, between the ideas and doing. But in a broader envelope, relating social and linguistic practices to the interlacing of a diversity of knowledges, techniques, logics, institutions, and technologies that developments in computational research are fundamentally transforming. So that's this sort of rejoinder to this sociogenic principle, right? In Winter, she transforms sociogeny to sociogenic principle. Okay, and then I think these next this next term, I think, is important, because it is addressing the stakes of the project that I think, when we're talking about a planetary turn, if you remember from last week, we're talking about it in terms of like how it could index a different historical epoch, a different historical episteme. So what are the stakes of what we're doing? And in Winter, she uses this term cosmogony, is very central for her, right? This kind of origin story. I prefer to use cosmology, just because I think it opens up other categories of intervention beyond these pure sort of like origin stories. And the definition that I found the most helpful, personally, is from Bentley Allen. He's a international relations scholar, because I find that term cosmology, when you don't qualify it, it's incredible where people take it. It can take on a very esoteric dimension. I just like to be very clear about what I appreciate about the term. So what are the stakes, right? So basically, for Bentley Allen, cosmology is composed of ontology, epistemology, temporality, cosmogony, and destiny. So to me, this is like offering us, when we're thinking about mapping winter very directly into these kind of concerns related to the planetary, cosmogony is certainly an incredibly important um, element of this. But I find that cosmology better integrates the epistemic dimension that she is insisting on, but not to mention temporality, right? Because I think that's also one huge problem of how do we develop, you know, models of the planetary where all these sort of like various temporal scales all of a sudden get laminated. How do we understand that? How do we relate to things like deep time or geotime, if you want? So I want to leave the category a little bit more broad and think about it in terms of the cosmological stakes of the project. And for those interested, this book is quite interesting. It's very Western European scientific oriented, but basically what Bentley Allen does is map out taking some paradigmatic historical discoveries and then seeing how they get ramified in terms of re-understanding international world orders. The It's a very interesting book. What is a bit terrifying about it is the hundreds of years gap between the scientific discovery, usually the persecution of the people who believe in the scientific discovery, until it's like very widely accepted and changes the view of how we imagine relating on an international scale. So the concrete example there would be, like going from I'm trying to remember exactly, but like a Copernican turn ushered in a sort of mechanical view of the, like a sort of balance of power, uh, general sense of orientation for international relations. So things of that nature, right? So what was the cascading set of consequences after a significant, if you want to call it, paradigm shift in based on scientific knowledge came about? Obviously, with the reason I find that a bit terrifying is that it doesn't look like we have several hundred years to ramify a lot of the knowledge that we now have. So that's yeah, concerning, if I'm going to be diplomatic. Um, right, and then the other concept that I wanted to introduce was this is a kind of like not hidden thing, but um, it definitely appeared in a lot of earlier works, and I just think it's kind of with me. So I thought, why not just be transparent and share it with you? It's this concept of inexistence that I'm taking from Alain Badiou, um, where it's, I know that I think it's Lyotard also talks about this. I'm definitely using the Badiousian sense, and it's basically to indicate a sense of like imminence, if you want. So we're not, when we're talking about like a paradigm shift, we're not necessarily like speaking about this kind of like and to be clear, I'm not like advocating the whole Badiousian event theory. So I'm just, I endorse this concept. I'm not on board with a lot of the event based um, theorizing, but it's basically like uh, how something will have a minimal degree of existence within a system, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? It doesn't have to be this brand new novel thing suddenly appear and shake things up. It's when the thing that inexists with relation to a structure of recognition has a degree zero, a minimum degree of recognition within that, you know within which a system sees or cognizes something, um, that it's about bringing that recognition into kind of a maximal degree. And I think I can explain that a little bit more clear if we look at the quote here on the second page. But here he's talking about a very concrete example of suffrage, the story of suffrage in Quebec, like you say here, between 1918 and 1950. So from 1918, women who, of course, ontologically exist in the Quebecois culture, before 1918, they inexist with the regard with the right to vote, with the civic right to vote. Likewise, for the indigenous population, this didn't come till much later. So the indigenous populations, it existed with regard to the civic right to vote, even though they ontologically, of course, exist. So I'm very interested in this movement between ontological existence and logical non-existence, if you want. And that's what the concept of the inexistent measures. So to bring something into this space of a maximal degree of existence, it's about inventing. It's according to Badiou, it's this kind of inserting into the regime of visibility. It's uh, and that's the act of politics, right? So the act of politics is this kind of um, making the part with no part, if you want to put it in Concierge's term, like come into some space of visibility. Um, which, of course, for those those thinkers who are more attuned to some of the dangers of visibility, right? I think this particular generation, uh, weighs puts so much weight on the question of visibility, and qua politics. And of course, today, that assertion even gets uh, difficult to make at such a universal scale, because just modes of being visible, right, being seen by surveillance systems, etc., that can be punitive. So, I mean, we're not going to go into all of that today, but I think that it's an interesting thing to see an update, a generational update that probably needs to happen because of the certain techno-political situations that we live in. But I think the main problem that I feel very connected to with Badiou, that he takes from Kierkegaard, is basically like how to inhabit the consequences of a concept or an idea, right? And that is, again, recalling last week we were talking about the importance of the relation between models of the planetary and questions of inhabitation otherwise, which, so we have this kind of movement between the realm of ideality and the realm of sets of practices. So yeah, as a kind of ramification of the idea. And then yeah, just kind of again to recap this movement from sort of ready-made space to this question of how to make ready for these new conditions to come, if you want, and what types of transformations this may entail if we if we understand ourselves in resituated ways. What are the cascading sets of consequences upon our modes of sensing, upon just phenomenology in general? And I always was inspired by this one line from this poem from Wallace Stevens, called "The future is description without place." Right. So again, we're kind of keep stumbling into this kind of question of placing, how to place things. Right. The episteme had this. This notion from Wallace Stevens, description without place. So, and then we'll use the example of, say, reproductive navigation would be like looking in an encyclopedia, right? And of course, an encyclopedia can be, you can keep adding new entries, we can keep adding new stuff, but the navigation space of that mode of knowledge acquisition remains static. It's in alphabetical order. We're not coming to we're not defining new concept spaces through which to come into contact with knowledge, through which to relate different things, right? Like in an encyclopedia, it could, content-wise, it could just be arbitrarily two completely unrelated items simply because they start with the same letters, right? It's not like a robust conceptual way to organize knowledge. Whereas in productive navigation, we are charted with the problem of constructing concept spaces. And navigation is basically a kind of program that allows us to run through them. So maybe I'll just you know quote here the second part of this quote, because I think it's helpful to kind of understand. So a digital record is worthless without being organized as a concept form, as encoded knowledge, right? Keeping in mind sociogeny is also a form of encoding. So understanding, i.e., decoding information, is needed in order to control and manage its knowledge potential. The digital age is not centered around bits and bytes, but around their accessibility and handling in sort data navigation. From the above, we learn that a powerful concept system for any field of knowledge must provide us with a thorough navigation method that works on an extensive concept space. And from the preceding discussion regarding depth and complexity, we deduce that navigation must have access to any encapsulated concept and permission to navigate on any possible concept path. So I think this is, again, when the reason why I was sort of pointing to this issue of, from ready made to making ready is the question of accessibility, right? Like, how are we going to make these new concept spaces that are maybe premised on a new spatial understanding? How can we make them accessible, intelligible, and therefore shareable, and not just an internal mental project or something like that. Um, so yeah, I think I would just maybe highlight some of the guiding questions that before we get into the winter stuff, like maybe highlight some of these questions so that maybe we can keep in the back of our minds as we go through winter. And again, if there's anyone that has any commentary or additional thoughts on some of those key terms that were sort of mapped out, or any questions, please, feel free to jump in. But yeah, the kind of questions that I wanted to just kind of be transparent about that, are kind of going through my mind while reading Winter, are, how to make this kind of, this, if we're talking about, these new genres of being human, again, we'll speak about what that means in Winter, these inexistent genres of humanness, if you will. How do we make them intelligible, navigable, and practicable? And again, this concept of the inexistent is helpful, I think, with regards to this question of planetary dimensionality, because arguably this condition ontologically exists, right? When we talk about the increased interconnection, interdependence, complexification of our techno-social reality, this is a kind of, this ontologically exists, but let's say logically inexist in relation to like developing ramified modes of coexistence within such a paradigm, right? Again, I've kind of repeating this kind of insistence on making ready, which I think is a potential role for art as a vehicle to make ready for these types of embedding these different modes of navigation. Yeah, and then the big question too is like, how do we envision constructing these concept spaces in order to exit this governing concept space of man, right? Because that is, of course, again, with Winter, we'll see that these figures of man one, man two, basically function as, even like, I would even say prior to the episteme for her, but nonetheless primary frames of reference around which social orders are come into being, are operationalized, and just justified in air quotes. Yeah, so I think with those questions in mind, it's good to yeah, jump right into Winter, who is basically making she's kind of making that case, right? This kind of counter cosmogonic counter cosmogonic, it's difficult to say, case via epistemology, right? So she's really kind of taking it from that angle. This is this is a quote from Linda Alcoff, who's just basically endorsing Winter. So, but of course, recognizing the Janus-faced histories, if you want, of European Enlightenment scientific thought, right? And that's a huge theme in Winter. Is this, how do we adjudicate this the Janus face reality of both the achievements that were enabled from these moments, but also that unleashed sort of unprecedented violence both on humans, environments, etc. as well. Um, so it's a quite like realist, I would say, position in that sense. Um, so basically, the text that we're looking, just to give it a bit of context, even though Winter, announces it herself, I think it's interesting to just be explicit about it. So where we read or the text that was proposed was a ceremony found. The easy title of the ceremony found towards the autopoietic overturn its autonomy of human agency and extraterritoriality of self-cognition. So this is basically an update of an essay that she had written in '84 that was more succinctly titled "The Ceremony Must Be Found After Humanism." And as far as I know, this 2015 text could be it's definitely got to be one of her last published texts, because like, as I mentioned, she's quite old at the moment. But nonetheless, it's very interesting to see her kind of try to answer to some of their own problems that she raised, much earlier. So basically, in this essay, she's based in the essay that we read, the updated version. She's basically trying to, she maps out her program, and then she basically is advocating for what she calls like a new studia, based on a kind of combination of Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, in order to generate the type of epistemologies or the epistemic revolution she thinks is required to achieve this autopoietic overturn. Right. So, and again, just please, stop me anytime I realize, Winter's very dense. She uses a lot of really, I would say, awkward configurations of phrasings. So, and I know that because I've been reading her for such a long time that I've just kind of internalized them, but I realize how alienating they were when I first was working with her. So don't be shy to chime in. You'll see here, like, these are, I'm just putting these quotes up so we can understand the scope of her project. So I think what is helpful for me about, mapping Winter into this kind of planetary framework, not only that, in an interview already like more than 20 years ago with David Scott, he's already putting that lens on, right? That she's kind of searching for, her project is nothing less than this planetary humanism that he calls it. And of course, CLR James, saying that she's like the most brilliant thinker the Caribbean has known. So these are some pretty good endorsements. But I think what I appreciate about her is how she kind of helps us confront this sometimes overgeneralizing or even, let's say, ahistorical accounts of our planetary present. That's like if we only focus on that statistical general level, right? Um, uh, and she focuses on these kind of epistemic aporias, she calls them, that have basically served to lubricate the overinflation of European man, and his kind of self-anointed monopoly on processes of reasoning. As an overinflation of European man is a kind of stand-in for humanity as such. So if there's like Latourians there, if we've never been modern, you could say we've never had humanity. I think is a pretty fair analog. And again, like her work does not deny, it even relies on, to be honest, some of the so-called achievements that were ushered in this kind of Enlightenment humanism, but it highlights the underside of this movement as inseparably co-constituting. So I think it's not just, I think there's some I think, two easy way outs by thinkers today that are, of course, aware of the histories unleashed in you know through in the period of enlightened thought, but they're just like, oh, it was at odds with itself. It was just, oh, Kant and Hegel being of their time, blah blah blah. Like, we can just move on. And I think she's going to push it further, and she's gonna call it a structure, an epistemic aporia, a foundational aporia. That is not just a contradiction, but it's like it's a structural component. It's structuring the space. Um, so yeah, basically the query that I want to kind of keep in mind is this, in this, again, pretty brief glimpse into the systemic model proposed by Winter, um, and it's widely, it's a kind of philosophical and historical account. Um, is basically like, if man and 1.2 are the figurative agents driving along your modernity into concrete existence, how are they operationalized? Through what aesthemes are their distinct self-conceptions externalized in spatial terms and made reproducible through technology? So, of course, you're hearing me repeat a lot of this stuff. We're introducing here a new term called aestheme, which was located in the essay that we hopefully read. This is a very interesting term. Winter was unable to locate the referent. It's a very obscure referent, just to some kind of McNeil archaeologist figure, if I'm not, or an anthropologist. But also, obviously, if we have the concept of the aestheme, or episteme, sorry, we can kind of understand what aesthemes mean. So this would be the representational regime that is subtending, or is sort of bracketed by these broad historical sort of brushstrokes. And so basically, Winter's projects takes, her starting point is essentially the origin of the universe. I mean, she's really giving us a thorough a thorough account, to the development of its life forms, with an emphasis on the so-called third event, that marks the evolution of the human as a sort of symbol-wielding creature. And because we are a symbol-wielding creature, we have the capacity to create fictions, and artificial worlds. So basically, the ramifications of this evolutionary accident are what underwrite Winter's broad problem space of work. That basically, as a species, we're hybrid biological and metabiological creatures. And it's this condition that enables us to become auto-instituting. We auto-institute human social organizations, and this is both empowering and entrapping, right? And she uses the term homo narrans, like narrative homo narrans, to emphasize how these descriptive statements, like who we are, these are the descriptive statements that serve as the kind of sociogenic replicator code, right? Who we are, these descriptive statements, they're the instituting force behind these autopoietic forms of organization. And again, for just to kind of give a little bit of context, that I think is important and highlights Winter's extremely interdisciplinary account. She's borrowing this again from the I guess quite highly novel scientific discoveries at the time. This kind of idea of autopoietic system, of course, comes from like Varela Maturana from biology. So again, this is nothing new today for us, but at the time of her coming to these ideas and these systems, she's borrowing cues from a wide variety of, let's say, the most sort of cutting edge discoveries at the time. So basically, these who we are descriptive statements, the sociogenic replicator code, it institutes these it like kicks off or serves as a frame of reference for those autopoietic structures. That means self-reproducing, such that socio-normative ways of being and relating, epistemic ways of knowing, and as well as our axiological commitments, right? The kind of values that we're upholding in performance, not just rhetorically, they synchronize with that descriptive statement. And because of that synchronization, they create a sort of law-like frame of reference for behaviors, hierarchies, taxonomies, and practices. So this is quite these descriptive statements are almost like a kind of gravitational force for these human social systems. And they basically, these descriptive statements, they serve as cosmogonical narrations in causal ways. So they stand in for laws of nature, or we could just more simply say naturalization, and they basically orient us and operationalize the coordination of behaviors and values required to preserve the particular human social system in question. So if we just put it simply, being human implies this socio-fictive partial realization of conditions of our own embedding, right? So we're creating the spaces or conditions of our own embedding, our technologies and environments that auto-catalyze adaptive behaviors, right? What we are told with this descriptive statements, the sociogenic replicator code, is that we're compelled to adapt ourselves to the ideals contained within that conceptual figuration. So these adaptive behavioral interactions in and to the world, they don't only bear externalities, like they don't just manifest in our tools and all that other stuff that we make because we are having this frame of reference of this idealized human, but they also, because we produce externalities that create, things and stuff in a world that we interact with, we're creating a feedback dynamic that actually like imprints the neurochemical level of our brain, such that and this is something more in the cognitive sciences known as like the artifactual mind thesis, right? In the sense that there'll be like modern brains and medieval brains and this and that basically all these sort of interactions with the stuffs that are produced leave signatures at a neurological level that can be seen. Um, so this generic human system model is what basically allows Winter, so she's describing that very general level of human social organization. So to be clear, when she's describing it on that general level, this would have been for her, she would say this is basically how human societies work at a universal level. They're going to have different figures of who that idealized genre of being human is as their referent, right? But nonetheless, as a kind of system, that is for her a kind of universal thing. And they're regionally specific, like I said, which is why we have diverse human, social orders that historically exist. But so that with that general system in mind, this is what allows Winter to explain how specific, who we are, descriptive statements have now driven like concretely this expansive bracket of history identifiable as long Euromodernity. Again, that Euromodernity term is borrowed from Lewis Gordon, meant to evoke the fact that modernity is not exclusively European. And for her, it commences with the invasion of the Americas in 1492, and it continues through to the present day. So basically what's also important about Winter here, right, because she's got this general model, but then maps specific instances of it, she's really calling upon us to consider history in a very multi-scalar way, or at least binocular, right, to kind of keep in mind this like species level description of our evolutionary history through to the specific regional instances that occur. So she's kind of asking us again, she's one of these general and particular, let's say, kind of thinkers. For anyone that has a lot of or any sort of knowledge about the species being concept from Marx, maybe that's something that we can keep in mind to address. I'm not well versed on that topic. I know it exists, and I've been asking myself, well, what is the difference between say Winter's account and that one? So if anyone has any insights, like keep that in mind. So basically, for in Winter's model, this long Euromodernity, it passes through two descriptive statement phases, if you want. And this would be man one and man two. And each of them, but what's important to recognize about each of them is that they are always an overinflation of of uh, of man with humanity. So basically, what's at work in these descriptive statements and their inflationary, uh, the fact of their inflation is basically a conflation of the normative with the natural, right? So the normative fictitious description we have suddenly becomes apprehended universally as natural, as just the way it is. Um, and right, so basically, yeah, these Western European cultures arrive at inventing, and this is like how Western European cultures, through the inflation of this figure of man one and man two, this is basically how Western European cultures come to legitimize or adjudicate otherness, even if they're differently grounded between the man one and the man two. So to put it really briefly, man one correlates with this is like the beginning of the Renaissance. So man one correlates with the physical sciences and marine navigation. So think like figures like Copernicus, Columbus are primary exemplaries of this. And in this way, we can understand otherness in this phase is tied to geography, right? The development of the so-called New World. And in Man 2, it coincides more with bioevolutionary sciences like Darwin and Malthus, where phenotypical, religious, cultural difference, and competitive economic fitness, this is what constitutes that like human animal split, reasoning or non-reasoning divide, which is how otherness is constituted. And more in more just common everyday speech, man two is more akin to Homo economicus, essentially, and the sort of cosmology linked with liberalism, come neoliberalism. So this kind of, what's important to mention here is that, man one, although like man one does have a religious underpinnings, man two certainly moves abruptly away from that, and that Western European ambition to secularize the human through these ontogenic or phylogenic categories alone, as if that alone could stand in as our descriptive statement, it produced basically an accompanying re-mythologization in the form of this over-representation. However, it did so under the very deceptive premise that this concept was purified of myth, so to speak. So it's this sort of illusion of mythic uncontamination that we can start to see what Winter means by this concept of the founding epistemic aporia, right? This sort of unresolvable thing. And just adjacently, I think that there's, in less obscure language, I think that there is also an interesting, if we're talking about these like structuring points of ignorance, epistemic aporia, to highlight, a really infamous text from Charles Mills on white ignorance, where ignorance is for him to indicate, because there's like innocent forms of ignorance, right? Like we just don't know. But then there's like structuring forms of ignorance, which are about like deliberate obscuring or deliberately making unknowable, if you want. So basically, this type of pernicious ignorance is a premise on a false belief. So it's via the recognition of this epistemological aporia that we can come to see how the Anthropocene nomenclature, for instance, rehearses this normative conditioning of epistemology, because it basically acts as a kind of almost like linguistic artifact, if you want, that confirms Winter's assessment that our current driving epistemes are oriented by this bio or phylocentric monohumanist over-representation, right? So, but I think this is really important. Is like, what are these foundational um, points, epistemological aporias, or I'd say more politically structured. What are these, structuring forces of ignorance, if you want, in the non-naive sense. So how does that make sense for everyone so far? How is everyone doing? Do you need a little break or should I just continue? Okay, I'll just continue. So basically, the stakes of this of her assessment, right, of her big model, um, is what she calls for in this autopoietic overturn, and it necessitates this corresponding epistemic transformation in order to exert this trap of this cosmogonical recursion, right? Because this is what she's describing, a recursive process here. So Winter's speculative counter cosmogony lays this kind of causal referential groundwork for new historical aesthetemes, or epistemes and aesthetemes. Um, and she's and in so doing, like, one thing I really want to highlight that I'm trying to work through is that she's kind of inadvertently, this is more my take on it, but she's inadvertently generating a concept of human freedom that is tied to uh, ideas of non-adaptation, right? Because basically, if all of our energies are focused on adapting to this referential, idealized concept, man, or what have you, um, there's a the freedom is not in adapting to that mode, but it's in the kind of self-conscious movement of non-adaptation from such a figure. And this is what allows us to construct discontinuities from historical, let's say, historical brackets, if you want. I think someone's mic is on. So unless you would love to speak, maybe it'd be great to keep it off. Thanks. So yeah, so I'd like us to keep that concept of non-adaptation in mind because it's going to come up a few times, I think, and probably in their third class, so next week, thinking about non-adaptive bootstrapping. So that's a kind of basically a very broad, quick and dirty overview of Winter's project, and hopefully that made sense. So I thought we could now like follow a little bit more closely what she's speaking about in the text, and especially in the one that we read, where she's basically, if the 1984 text was about the need to find a ceremony, now we have the ceremony found. So she's made a proposition, at least, that we can work with. So just to be clear, what does she mean by ceremony? So it's extremely clear. The ceremony for Winter is the negation of the two forms of co-human negation indexed by Man 1 and Man 2. So basically, when she's talking about the co-human, so she's talking, when you invent Man 1 and inflate that as if humanity, you're already like chopping up what the human is. You're already like rendering those non-humans. So the ceremony is the negation of these two forms of constitutive co-human negation. So again, I would make the claim, maybe you agree, maybe not, that when we're thinking about what this ceremony is, to me, this is bound to thinking about how to invent modes of non-adaptation. And of course, in fairness, that's not a permanent state. It's not like you can't be permanently just as you can't be permanently in revolution or something, right? Like you can't be permanently in non-adaptation. So it is in relationship to adaptation as well, but this, let's say, first movement would be one of non-adaptation. Right, and so basically, just to give a little bit more, what I'm going to do in this part is basically give a little bit more precision to these figures, Man 1 and Man 2, and then do a very quick, let's say, quick presentation of certain technologies, imaging, etc., that was co-emergent with these figures, so that we can start bringing in the domain of techne alongside, charting this kind of historical co-emergence, if you want. So as we know, Man 1 emerges in the Renaissance, um, beginning in 1492. This is the first map, I believe, with the word America written on it. Um, and and basically, so this is the beginning, of course, of the colonization of indigenous peoples, which further which this figure of man further lubricated the Middle Passage and the enslavement of Black Africans to actually construct the so-called New World. So the first negation of co-humanity here is based on selection and disselection of the human according to the standards of a Eurocentrically conceived notion of rationality. So, and drawing the line between those rational creatures and those who are like subordinate to nature. So basically, the consequence of this is that those who are outside of these confines of Man 1 are basically apolitical creatures, with the consequence that they are denied historical agency, right? And of course, this is like one of the most infamously racialized claims in Hegel's work, where he's describing the African continent. We don't even need to quote him, but plenty of text to refute it. And I think the scholar Badur Alagra has, some helpful contextualization. So basically, Man 1 emerged out of the Renaissance as a Christian man, transformation that occurred in part as a response to the encounter in the New World. This Christian man would later be resignified in order to conform to the emerging secularization route, which reinscribed man as moral into a new formulation of man as rational and political. So basically, Man 1 is correlated with this Homo politicus, as I said. Those who were not part of the category Man 1, ahistorical, apolitical creatures of nature, according to the perverse logic of othering at that time. And later on, with Man 2, so we have a revision for the transition between Man 1 and Man 2. This is where we get into the kind of Homo economicus figure, made possible by Western episteme's Darwinian division between the naturally selected Europeans, marked by a boundary that inscribed Man 2 as breadwinning and man's other as laboring, right? So this is basically the justification for accumulation of wealth. So the violence of, and I think this is also a really important point of what Alagra says, the violence of man's overrepresentation is in its foreclosure of a non-hierarchical referent we, right? So this is something we maybe want to emphasize, like what would be a non-hierarchical referent we of humanity as a kind of ambition to articulate beyond mere words. And of course, like the what's going on at the time, at least in the world of visual arts, is of course the birth of Renaissance painting, perspective. So, and this is something that Damian Javonovich has pointed out, that the more profound than these icons of belonging to Renaissance that we're all very familiar with, Brunelleschi, Alberti, etc., was the reinvention of modern space. So basically, modernity or Euromodernity arrives with the construction of a new spatial ordering schematic that's very different from medieval space. So the space that is this, even if we're operating in this like 2,000-year-old conceptually speaking, Euclidean spatial paradigm, if you want, of like familiar space, or thinking that we know space a priori outside of the domain of mathematics, is very different from the space belonging to medieval and how things were ordered. So this perspective changed that by introducing a new idea of universal space, a space that was even, measurable, and equally potent in all directions, and whose ordering conforms to the fixed point of the observer's gaze. So the sort of argument that I'm suggesting, or the thing that I'm wanting us to think, to together simultaneously, is my argument is that it is because of this particular invention of space that this abstract conceptual figure of man one finds a place to situate himself in an idealized site, with tools and methods of reproducible representation to embed this otherwise purely philosophical figure. Um, so this is sort of the pitch, right? That is like guiding us, or the hypothesis, if you want. This is also the time during the Renaissance that the writer Keith Tilford reminds us is when we first see the emergence of the author as artist. So the implementation of spatial understanding, privileging this kind of singular vantage point in Renaissance perspective, it not only naturalizes this human binocular vision as a so-called naturalistic account depicting reality, um, but it serves as a sort of prehistorical nourishment, I think, for the developments of political liberalism, where the individual is understood as a sort of basic building block unit of any social system. And most of liberal societies' freedoms, legislative freedoms, and so on, are located at that scale of a unit, right? When you were mentioning this kind of units of organization, that would be one key figure, this kind of individual. So of course it would be, one thing if these developments just happened, regionally speaking, and it was just a European phenomenon. But this method of spatial localization, of understanding space, understanding relationships, placing things, etc., became a tool for the operational inflation of man one, as a stand-in for humanity at large. So for those of you who had a chance to read the Massimo Scolari text, for instance, with this, it's a very short one. It's not a philosophical text, it's more of a historical one. It's even quite funny because you can tell Scolari is quite pleased that these missionaries failed in their attempt to win over the Chinese with their image mastery. So this is basically this is happening in the 16th century. The Jesuit missionaries arrived in China, trying to win over the Chinese with this particular perspectival genre. And they went far beyond, as he noted, just trying to teach the Chinese the proper way to represent things, but was also trying to impart a particular way of thinking. So it was trying to advocate basically convergence between sight and thought itself, right? And I think what's important between these two different ways of depicting reality is, of course, in one version we have, in the European version, we have things, getting things changing. Reality changes proportion depending on the position of the ideal observer inferred by the work. So basically in that model, reality is distorting itself to conform to human vision, whereas in other models of perspectival, methods, if you want, reality, the proportions of reality are preserved, so they don't conform to the gaze of a human. So they don't, like, there's not going to be a vanishing point or something. So the tenacious rejection from the Chinese of this way of spatially organizing representations of reality, in reference to the measure of, man as the measure of all things, is really hilariously summarized with this quote from that Scolari documents from Chouchet as saying, he who judges painting according to the concept of resemblance shows the understanding of a child. So you can see what sort of opinions were going on at the time in this lobbying for representational dominance. I don't even know what you call it. Hegemony, if you want. So yeah, and then of course, the beginning of this period, the 1492 period, obviously coincides with, we're talking about the so-called discovery of the Americas, which is impossible. If you had a chance, I know it was additional reading, but the text from William Bollhauer is quite compelling, basically making the case that um, uh, not only is the so-called New World defined by cartography, like obviously its discovery wouldn't have even been possible without it. Um, so in his account, there's a quote, continuous semiotic play between the matter under analysis, the land, and the form of analysis, the map. And he basically calls the culture of the map America's precognition. Um, and he's urging us to study the map, similar to Siegart's text from last week, not as a representation of space, but as a space of representation. Once again, bypassing this sort of, I think, too limiting binary of like the map versus the territory, right? Um, so basically, Bellhauer emphasizes the power of cartographic typologies precisely at the same moment, right? This is, again, this kind of co-emergence of this philosophical European humanism and the development of these cartographic and therefore navigational capabilities are happening at the same time. So the genre of cartography, its most important historical moment when it was called upon to invent the other hemisphere of the globe, coincided with the critical moment in which the conventions of the modern Ptolemaic map were jostling with those of the old medieval map to represent American space. Cartographic form, in other words, was undergoing a paradigmatic shift, and its laboratory for experimenting with new structuring techniques was, of course, the New World. So, Bellhauer kind of goes on to call this America is a semiotic drama, semiotic drama of the map. Um, and so basically this kind of third level of existence, if you want, this kind of semiotic power, not just the fact of the map, but its semiotic power really ties in well to this force, in again, in its Janus-based reality that Winter kind of asserts uh, with this naming of us as a homo neurons, like narrative creatures who are, it's not just descriptive, it's an operational thing. Um, so I'll just close with the Bellhauer quote here. So what is also needed is a global map of the map's sign activity so that one can go beyond single and necessarily partial cartographic performances. This will require us to understand how each of the elementary systems of image, word, and line produce semiotic information. That is, how the map's object, the world, is transformed into these three different ways of encoding space. So this is also going to be we're kind of building up a bit of a vocabulary attached to other disciplines with this idea of encoding, right? This is also related to the sociogenic replicator code, as we mentioned. And we're slowly moving into this idea that Anil Bawakavia has been writing about in computational space in terms of embedding and encoding. But, right. So this was just basically a very quick way. I mean, there's a lot more work to be done here, but just to kind of make the brief case about thinking about Winter's figurations of Man 1 and Man 2 through this kind of lens of techne, if you want, in order to understand how they became operational. Because these figures just don't arrive, they're not just like ideas in someone's head and then they manifest Euromodernity. I mean, that's like a bit ridiculous. So they need to find ways to perform themselves at scale. So basically, yeah, so this is how the kind of foundational reinvention of space for embedding these encoded figures of man is inseparable from the operationalization of this auto institution that Winter talks about. So the point, of course, is not just to kind of show how we got here, right, to give us this historical account, although it is important for understanding path dependencies, right, like things that are irreversible potentially now. But is to kind of use this as an example for, on the need to construct other sites and conditions of embedding from which to escape this kind of punitively interpolating uh, who we are descriptive statements that are like proving lethal to human inhabitability on Earth. So the spatial aestheme that undergirds this Euromodern procedures of localization, it exists both in this the creation of an author, as we said, right? Um, and that is particular register as in the author of an artwork, but more importantly, it gains this spatialization also gains mimetic traction because the method of spatialization is anonymous, right? Like anyone could copy that mode of seeing and reproduce a naturalistic vision, a naturalistic picture based on a method. And I think this is quite important to think about today in art in terms of like, you know, what is our relationship to something like templating and mimesis and developing methods that are anonymous that allow for more attractability rather than the more, let's say, conservative picture of art is like making something original, singular, etc., and all of the commodity fetishism that goes on with that. um so how are we doing? Does anyone want to stop and have a chat about any of this? Or do you need a break? What should I just kind of trying to think? There's not too much more to go. It's more. I just thought we could. I take a little pause here in case anyone wanted to intervene because I do want to at least touch upon some of the last bits of Winter's text, so that we can at least uh, yeah, bring on the table or bring into the class what she is proposing as a kind of, in her words, this new, epistemic revolution. What type of new study would be amenable to this task, if you want. All right. So yeah, so I think, yeah, we can just like kind of wrap up now with a little bit of that, touching upon, let's say, the second part of the. We'll do this a little bit more briefly so we can have a time for discussion. But the second part of that winter essay, I think, is worth talking about. Um, Again, because I do want to get into thinking through this question of like how to, the question of those uh, how to exit those governing epistemes of man, um, through an idea of non-adaptive bootstrapping, and this is mainly to try to, you could say, in a way, trying to think about like accountable forms of speculation, if you want, because at least in my field in arts and design, there's a kind of I call it like possibility idealism. Like you just say possibility, possibility, and you don't define anything, or speculation, and then there's like zero accountability to reality. And I think that there's a lot to be. So I will be using that as a way to start moving from possibility to realizability. Again, that's for next week, but that's what's going to be entailed with this non-adaptive bootstrapping coming up. So it's a little teaser, but it's the way that I'm trying to imagine. Uh, I guess in a way, trying to, I personally I wouldn't use the term ceremony for this exit, but okay. So if I prefer this non-adaptive bootstrapping as opposed to ceremony, but they're basically synonymous, and that's what I would mean by it in winter sense, the ceremony. So given that such cosmogonically charted webs of significance are at the same time the indispensable condition of our being able to performatively enact ourselves as being human in these genre specific terms of an I and a we. This is a quote from the text, right? This is going, just to be clear where this is coming from. How can we then come to know our social reality outside the terms of the oi socializing mode of auto-institution, in whose web-spinning field alone we are recursively enabled performatively to enact ourselves in the genre-specific terms of our fictive modes of kind? So if that's not a mouthful, I don't know what is. It's like the simple way of putting it is like, how can we justify thinking outside the given terms of self-reference that now orient our reality. We can just keep it, summarize it in that way. Um, so if we're going to answer, this is kind of Winter's answer to this philosophical problem of thinking, outside, or she says in her text below, right, with her evocation of Rastafarianism, um, thinking outside these given referential indexes. So this is where Winter kind of merges Fanoni and sociogeny with Aimé César's Science of the Word program. And she, again, to insist, she supplanted Freud from the lineage of paradigm shifters. When we talk about paradigm shifts, we talk about like Copernicus, Darwin, and then Freud threw himself in there, which is kind of dubious. But she like removes him, puts in Fanon, and says now we have to complete the epistemic revolution. Again, the important part of the sociogenic plea is to reintroduce or reappraise this, I would say, existential dimension of being human, and to put that on par with also just like scientific inquiry. So this very much is qualitative sort of dimension, not only what it is to be human, but what it is to be like human, if you put it like that. And and he's using this to like I said, to compare and contrast humanists in the mode of the genomic principle that defines the species identity of us, um, uh, alongside the quality, like what it is like to be an individual of this species. So her epistemic integration of this third level of existence is in many ways a response to the need to overcome this, CP Snow two divide sort of thing, the divide of the humanities and the hard geophysical biosciences on the other. And she does this by backing Aimé César's Science of the Word / Nature. So again, for César, he recognizes the achievements certain sciences have had, but chastises them or criticizes them for saying they remain impoverished with regards to addressing the qualitative dimensions of human life. But I think it's also interesting to see here that he's kind of trying to yoke together this general species concern together with the individual or the particular, right? Because that's I think a lot of the thinkers that we're calling upon have that general tendency in their various disciplines, and they're trying to work out what that is. So again, and he's notably a peer, of course, of Glissant. When I say peer, I don't necessarily mean that they're friends, but in the same historical space as like Glissant, Grothendieck, and so on, who we looked at last week, thinking through this particular universal relation. So Winter's proposition of a new studia is a kind of to nourish this autopoietic overturn is bound to her demand for the creation of what she calls the counter cosmogony. So again, in my parlance, I want to up the ante and say, like, how about counter cosmology? Right. So the counter cosmological demand positions human, to reiterate, in this movement of non-adaptation, because it implies a conscious agency needed to construct discontinuities. So the problem of coming to know our social reality outside the terms of this always socializing mode of auto-institution is a question of how to actuate non-adaptive frames of reference that can enable what Winter calls, and this is a quote from her, an outer view, from which perspective the grammars of regularities of boundary and structure maintaining discourses are perceivable. So these outer views establish new referential terms, positions, and sites, very important, through which to invent ceremonies of exit from this punitive cosmological trap that we're in. And and this is quite important, right? Because weren't we just we keep talking about the site and situatedness, and we talked all about Haraway last week, and now we're going on about outer views, right? But again, this is not, an outer view isn't a view from nowhere. It is the necessity to construct a new concept space from which to generate a new vantage point of entry. So I think that's quite important. But it also gives us a lot of traction to say that we're not just bound to the givenness of whatever site is given to us. So again, it's not, this outer view isn't a rehearsal of the positivist delusion claiming a view from nowhere. Rather, it's making intelligible and perceivable these contingent, historical fictions that govern the coordination or configuration of a world. And here, I'd just like to bring in, to close out on a productive and fun note, because of course the essay that I did send you of my own was about fictions, and I think this example from W.E. Du Bois called the megascope is quite interesting, because he not only, this is less known because the works are not published, but very often between his major works, major philosophical contributions, he was writing this kind of like pulpy fiction, science fiction, and weird stuff. And in this one particular text from about 1908 to 1910, he invented, in the fiction, he invented this technology called the megascope, which allowed people who, which is essentially like an Oculus Rift, which allowed people to see what he called the great near. So you would have a telescope to see the stars far away. The great near was, this device would allow you to see the structures of racism and classism, etc., for all the users who would wear it. Again, this is a fiction. So not only do we have this example of a fiction in a story, a fictional technology in a story that offers this different vantage point, and in the story of Du Bois, it's a black it's the scientist who invents this technology is a black sociologist, a white sociologist pair, a couple comes in fascinated. First, they think he's a slave. Then they realize he's an actual sociologist. But for them, they don't see these kinds of structures in the world. So this sociologist had built this device to allow folks who don't experience this to see this plain as day. But I think even more importantly is in the work of Du Bois himself, is that knowing, and this was sort of theorized by Whitney Battle-Baptiste, a brilliant archaeologist, that this kind of engagement with fictional writing for Du Bois between these major oeuvres was what allowed him to kind of explore and served as a kind of catalyst for the creation of these things. So not only was fiction an outlet, but it was like what enabled the significant sociological positions of him to emerge, which is a bit less known. So basically, to get back to this new studia that is, according to Winter, needed. This is what is going to be required of yoking together this kind of general, particular, existential, statistical, if you want, view, which is, that's what will enable this kind of epistemic revolution required to generate such outer views, if you want. It refutes a kind of approach to the planetary from the dimension of this sheer immensity or generalizing status, but it activates procedures of localization that bind this new geo-epoch to transform practices of inhabitation, which would of course take place in our literary works and so on and so forth. So I'll just close by saying, like, I wouldn't position this new studia as a rejection of the real. Certainly Winter is one of the maybe few humanities scholars at that time doing deep dives into archaeology, biology, chemistry, and so on, alongside material that is like proper to the domain of being a humanities scholar. But it's really trying to advocate for some sort of integrative approach of bringing these two worlds together, which I find quite helpful, even if it's a very loose sketch in how we're going to be thinking about the interfacing between models and everyday life practices that are going to be transforming as a result. So then just kind of finish up on that, and yeah, and then we can, if you still have energy. I know today was a lot, but we can have a nice discussion if you're still up for it.